Hi everyone. Have you ever felt like you just can't seem to get anything right? Like no matter how hard you try, you just can't seem to live up to your own expectations? Well, if so, you might be struggling with perfectionism. Now, perfectionism is a common trait that many people struggle with, but not many people fully understand. It's more than just wanting things to be done well or having high standards for yourself. It's a constant need for flawlessness and an inability to accept anything less than perfect. Now, this is going to be the first part of a three-part mini-series on perfectionism. And in today's video, we're going to go into a deep dive about what perfectionism really is, the different types of perfectionism, and how to recognize the signs of perfectionism in yourself. But before we get into that, just a couple of disclaimers to go over. I'm a registered psychologist in the province of British Columbia, Canada, and this video is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute or replacement for advice from your doctor or mental health professional. Now, with those things out of the way, let's start talking about perfectionism. So, the first thing we need to start with is talking about a definition of perfectionism. What is perfectionism? Well, perfectionism is a personality trait characterized by the unrelenting pursuit of flawlessness and setting extremely high standards for yourself or for other people. People with perfectionism often have an obsessive need to get things right and might be highly critical of themselves and others when they don't meet those really high standards. Now, in some cases, reasonable amounts of perfectionism can be a positive trait, as it can lead to hard work and strict attention to detail. But it can also be harmful when it leads to unrealistic expectations, fear of failure, paralysis, and difficulty getting things done. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't realize about perfectionism is that it's often rooted in fear. People who struggle with perfectionism often have a deep-seated fear of failure, rejection, or even success. They believe that if they don't do everything perfectly, they'll be judged or criticized by others, or that they'll lose control over their lives. It's also important to note that perfectionism isn't the same, and it's not the same thing as striving for excellence. People often think of perfectionism and striving for excellence as the same thing, but they're actually quite different. Perfectionism is characterized by this need for flawlessness, extremely high standards, and it's driven by that fear of failure and need to avoid criticism. Whereas striving for excellence is different. It's about setting goals for yourself and working towards them in a healthy and productive way. Striving for excellence focuses on personal growth and development, and it involves setting goals that are challenging but achievable. And that's the key point. Striving for excellence can be motivating, and it can lead to a person to develop a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. It doesn't involve that obsessive need to be perfect or the fear of failure, and it doesn't rely on unhealthy coping mechanisms like avoidance and rumination, which are things you often see in perfectionism. So, while striving for excellence can lead to personal growth and a sense of accomplishment, perfectionism often leaves a person feeling frozen, stuck, and burnt out. Now, when we talk about perfectionism, it's important to recognize that there are different types of perfectionism. And depending on the type of perfectionism that you might have, it's going to lead to very different types of experiences. So, the first type of perfectionism is something referred to as self-oriented perfectionism. And this is the type of perfectionism that people often think about when they hear the term perfectionism. In self-oriented perfectionism, you have really high personal standards and expectations for yourself. You strive for excellence in everything that you do, and you have a strong desire to achieve these high goals. This type of perfectionism may involve things like working really long hours and sacrificing areas of your personal life to ensure that you can reach these lofty expectations and objectives. But it can also result in you being very critical of yourself, and you may feel like you're never good enough. This type of perfectionism can leave people prone to anxiety and depression as they experience intense feelings of shame or guilt when they don't meet these incredibly lofty and aspirational expectations. An example of this is a student who sets a goal of getting straight A's all the time. Now, that's a lofty and admirable goal, and the student wants to perform well, they want to do their best, so that in and of itself isn't a bad thing. The problem is when that student receives 1B on a test, and then they beat themselves up and feel like a complete failure. As a result, they might study obsessively, sacrificing important aspects of their life, like spending time with friends or getting enough sleep, to make sure that they don't make any mistakes and are hyper prepared for any test or assignment. So that's self-oriented perfectionism. The second type of perfectionism is something called other-oriented perfectionism. And in this type of perfectionism, it involves having really high expectations for other people and expecting other people to meet those lofty standards. People who are other-oriented perfectionists are often hypercritical of other people and may become frustrated or angry when their high expectations of other people aren't being met. And this can result in strain to relationships with other people, as other people might feel like they're being judged or criticized by the perfectionist. And for good reason, because they probably are being judged and criticized by the other-oriented perfectionist. For people with other-oriented perfectionism, they may struggle with delegating tasks as they feel that they can't trust other people to meet their very high and lofty standards and expectations. Now, you may have come across this in bosses that you've had. Bosses who are other-oriented perfectionists will expect their employees to work at the same level of perfectionism that they do, and they might become angry or disappointed when their employees make mistakes. These types of bosses may micromanage their employees and expect them to work long hours or do a lot of unpaid overtime in order to achieve their unrealistic expectations of what should be accomplished. These types of bosses, they're not great to work for. And the third type of perfectionism is something called socially prescribed perfectionism. Now, this type of perfectionism is driven by external pressures, such as societal expectations or the perceived expectations of other people. People who are socially prescribed perfectionists feel like they need to meet certain standards in order to be accepted or valued by other people. And this can lead to high levels of anxiety and stress, as they might feel like they're constantly under scrutiny. Socially prescribed perfectionists may also feel like they can't express their true selves, as they may feel like they need to conform to a certain image or persona in order to fit in or to be accepted by other people. An example of this is a social media influencer who feels like they need to maintain a perfect image and to be constantly flawless in order to gain more followers. Constantly flawless to keep those followers interested and to keep up a particular reputation. They may carefully Photoshop any images of themselves or feel like they can't post anything that's not perfectly curated and that matches their carefully considered social image. As you can imagine, this can be extremely exhausting, as the person can never be their true selves and always has to be what they think other people expect them to be. So those are the three main types of perfectionism. And you might be wondering, well, okay, I understand that, but how do I tell if I'm just a perfectionist? How do I tell if I'm a perfectionist or just a really high achiever? What are the signs and symptoms of perfectionism that I want to look out for? Now, there are a number of things, another number of signs that you might be a perfectionist. Things like setting extremely high standards for yourself and other people. I've talked about this. This is kind of a core feature of perfectionism. If you're overly self-critical or highly critical of other people. You might be a perfectionist if you procrastinate or avoid doing things due to fear of failure. If I don't know that I can do it perfectly, I'm not going to do it. Engaging in unhealthy coping mechanisms such as ruminating or avoidance when faced with perceived imperfections. I made a mistake on that test and I keep thinking about how I could have gotten that question wrong. What was wrong with me? How could I have screwed that up? You might be experiencing perfectionism if you have difficulty completing tasks or projects because you have to go over them again and again and again to make sure that everything is perfect and that there is no room for error. This can make a person extremely inefficient. You might have difficulty enjoying achievements or successes. If I get 98% on that math test, I get frustrated and upset with myself about that one question that I got wrong. And this takes any sense of joy or accomplishment or reward out of getting 98%. I forget about the 49 questions that I got right, and I get down on myself about that one question that I got wrong. You may experience problems in relationships because you have really high standards for other people and they get frustrated with you because you're constantly being critical of them for not living up to those very high standards. You may be a perfectionist if you hold a belief that making a mistake or having some sort of flaw is completely unacceptable and that it must be avoided at all costs. This is a cognitive symptom of perfectionism, an attitude and assumption about yourself and the world that revolves around a belief that things can and must be perfect in order for everything to be okay. You may struggle to delegate tasks or to ask other people for help due to the belief that you have to do everything yourself in order to make sure that it's perfect. Therefore, I have to take on everything, which just sets me up for being overworked and burnt out. And I can't ask other people for help because that might come across as a sign of weakness or a flaw that maybe I can't do it all myself. You may have difficulty making decisions due to a belief or an assumption that there is only one perfect option. Imagine a college student who's trying to choose a major and is struggling because they believe that there's only one perfect major that's going to lead to a successful career and a happy life. The college student spends hours researching different majors, trying to find the one that fits the criteria for perfection, making a pros and cons list for each major, analyzing each one to the tiniest detail, and still can't make a decision. The student is paralyzed by their belief that there is only one perfect option and is terrified that if they choose the wrong major, they're going to be stuck in a career that they hate and that they'll never be able to achieve their goals for their life. As a result, they're paralyzed to make any decision. You might find yourself overly concerned with the opinions of other people and are constantly looking to seek validation or approval from others. If you make a post on social media, you keep careful track of how many people have liked that post or how many people have reacted to it. And usually, it's never enough. And you're left wanting, wishing that more people had reacted to your post. Another common symptom or sign of perfectionism is being inflexible and resistant to change due to a belief that there's only one right way of doing things and that this right way is the only way to do it. You may have a boss at work who believes that his way of doing things is the only correct way, and he expects his team members and you to follow his lead without question. He's resistant to any changes or new ideas that come from his team, and he thinks that those ideas won't be as effective as the way he wants it to be done. Have you ever had a boss like that? How do you feel about working for somebody like that? Probably not great, as this type of other-oriented perfectionism style just leads to people becoming frustrated and demotivated. Now, if you've watched any of my videos on intolerance of uncertainty, you might recognize that there's a fair bit of overlap between perfectionism and intolerance of uncertainty. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If you can do things perfectly, it eliminates any sense of uncertainty in a situation because you've achieved perfectionism. Because you've achieved perfection. But just like with intolerance of uncertainty, you can never fully eliminate uncertainty from the situation. And similarly with perfectionism, you can never know for certain that you've done something perfectly. It's a no-win game, and it can contribute to feelings of anxiety, depression, and discontentment because it's never enough. And if you want to learn more about intolerance of uncertainty, I'd encourage you to check out this video. So that's all for today's video on perfectionism. As always, thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I'll see you in the next one.